It's a pleasure to welcome you here to Harvard Law School. My name is Jim Cavallaro. I'm a clinical professor here, and I'm also the executive director of the Human Rights Program. I want to go through a few things as we get started, just to tell you what we have on store for you this afternoon, evening. But first, I just wanted to let you know this is an event that's been sponsored by our program, the Human Rights Program, by the HLS Advocates for Human Rights, by the National Lawyers Guild, HLS chapter. Through the Human Rights Program, we want to thank the Skirball Fund for our work on accountability for violations committed by U.S. authorities, human rights violations. And I'd also like to thank and give a shout out to Mindy Roseman, to Deborah Popowski, to Jeremiah, to Caitlin, to Matt Spurlock, and to Marissa, and also to Charlene Yim, who've done a lot of work in putting this event together. And judging by the size and the intensity of this group, I think they've done well. We'll start between about 5 and 6:15 with a conversation between Daniel Ellsberg and Scott Horton right behind me. They'll be speaking for something on the order of 45 minutes in that back and forth, and then we'll switch to Q&A. At that point, we'll have a break for dinner. We have Indian food coming in. I'm not sure if it'll be enough for this crowd. We may have to order a bit more. So we'll try and share and have it go as far as it can go. And maybe, Jeremiah, if you're here, get some more food. At 6:30, we'll screen the film The Most Dangerous Man in America, a documentary about Daniel Ellsberg leaking of the Pentagon Papers. And afterwards, for another 20 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session with Mr. Ellsberg himself. So what I'd like to do is just, for those, there are some here from Harvard Law School who I recognize, and just to contextualize, tell you one anecdote which might be of interest. You pass every day Griswold Hall as you walk to and from different buildings around the law school. You may know that's named for Erwin Griswold, who, among other things, served as the Solicitor General in the case of New York Times Company versus United States at the Supreme Court, the case which involved Daniel Ellsberg and the papers. And he argued there, and I quote, that the publication would cause great and irreparable harm to the security of the United States, end quote. In 1989, Erwin Griswold recanted that position and wrote in a piece in the Washington Post, quote, "I have never seen any trace of a threat to the national security from the publication," end quote. So just a note to put it in the context of buildings and people and Harvard Law School. And then if I could, I'd like to introduce Scott Horton, and then our own Professor Charlie Nesson will introduce Daniel Ellsberg. Scott Horton is really a remarkable figure. I'll give you just a very brief list of some of the things that he's able to do in the 24-hour day. He's a distinguished lawyer, a lifelong human rights advocate. He also teaches at Columbia Law School. He's also a regular writer at Harper's Magazine. I commend to you No Comment. And many of us consider it a must-read column. He's been responsible for reports and investigations about extraordinary renditions that have circulated throughout our public discourse and have changed a lot of the thinking about that horrendous practice, which involves torture. I can use the T word, in my humble opinion. He's appeared before Congress regularly, testifying before committees, before the House and the Senate. He's a founder of the American University in Central Asia. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also a member of the board of NYU Center on Law and Social Security. I've got some other achievements of his. I will leave them off so that we can get to the substance. But before we do, let me ask, if I may, if Professor Nesson would like to say a few words about his former client. You may not know that Professor Nesson, along with Leonard Boudin, defended Ellsberg on charges of theft and espionage brought on the same day, filed on the same day as the victory before the United States Supreme Court. So, Professor Nesson.
Thank you, Jim. I have to say it's just a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be able to introduce Dan to you here. And I feel that I'm not only introducing Dan, but in a way I'm introducing the film as well, which I totally commend to you. This is a wonderful film. Thank you. So, Daniel Ellsberg, I met him before the Pentagon Papers arose as a big issue over the question of what he should do with them at the time when he had them, and no one seemed that interested in looking at them. It was, in fact, an exercise of Dan's genius, which I saw unfold, that he took this body of documents in which he had invested himself and made it what it became. At first, he was peddling them. He was trying to get the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee to publish them in the Congressional Record. He was trying to get Harvard Law School to make them the subject of our Ames moot court final. He was looking for someone, please. And then he hooks up, and I'm sure he will fill you in with some of that story. When the Pentagon Papers hit in the New York Times, all hell broke loose. At that point, he was represented by Leonard Boudin, wonderful lawyer from New York, who was teaching here as a visiting professor, and I as a quite junior faculty member at that time, working with Leonard. And what unfolded then was an amazing 3-week period in which Ellsberg was the most wanted man in the country. He was underground, and different newspapers around the country, one after the other, followed suit with the New York Times, and in resistance.
Lights on, please. Back by the door.
In resistance to the United States Justice Department, which was doing its damnedest, the Pentagon Papers start popping up in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the St. Petersburg Times and the Washington Post, and newspaper after newspaper joining the effort to make these papers a focal point of national interest. Dan was first indicted here in Boston. Federal grand jury here, initial indictment. It was subsequently superseded by an indictment for theft and espionage in Los Angeles, Middle District of Los Angeles. And what ultimately ensued was a prosecution that spanned 2 years. I actually took leave, went west, lived with the group of people that you will meet in this wonderful movie. I have to say, and would like very much to say, that I'd like you, in watching the film, to honor one person in particular in addition to Dan. That's a man named Lenny Weinglass. Lenny died yesterday, and we mourn his loss. He was just a wonderful, excuse me, I'm sorry. He was a wonderful man. He epitomizes a lawyer who helped people who needed help in facing the law, and he made his career out of it. You'll see him, he's worthy of every bit of respect. But, all right, Dan, let me just introduce him. Dan was a junior fellow at Harvard. That's kind of reserved by Harvard for Harvard's smartest young men. He then went and worked for Secretary McNamara in the Defense Department as one of his whiz kids. McNamara assembled a kind of group of young geniuses around him. Dan is, I would say, the most focused intelligence that I've ever come close to. He has an ability to focus in on something and apply his brain to it in a way that seems amazingly tenacious when you're experiencing him on a day-to-day basis. And when you see the buildup of what is produced, it's remarkable. Now, yes, there was a prosecution in Los Angeles, but what there really was, in terms of my education, was a man who figured out how to litigate in the court of public opinion. He litigated not only in court, Boudin and Lenny Weinglass, and I had something to do with that, but he carried this case on from the steps of the courthouse in a way that totally absorbed the country and brought the whole of the resistance in behind Dan to the point where he truly became the most dangerous man in America. He is an extraordinary figure, and I commend him to you. I believe you will have a wonderful time listening to him. So Dan, go to it. May I just add one thought that I'm sorry I left out? Present day, I'm speaking back in the 70s, present day, Dan is the #1 voice with respect to WikiLeaks, and in particular, the injustice that is being done to the young man who leaked these papers to Assange. Dan has been on the front line. It's been his voice and his example which has been just a beacon to those of us who feel that something is truly wrong when Obama can say that it's okay to hold someone, young kid, 21 years old, in a prison for 23 hours a day in solitary, making him sleep naked, and that's perfectly okay for someone who hasn't even been tried yet in the United States. Dan.
I have to say one thing. I had to laugh when I was hearing Charlie talk so glowingly about my laser-like focus and tenacity, because what he's describing, the subtext there is an unbearable client, a real pain in the ass to have to deal with day after day. So anyway, thank you for being so gracious about it, Charlie.
Dan, let's start with a focus on a particular WikiLeaks document. So we just heard Solicitor General Griswold's claim made to the Supreme Court about the damage that would be done to the United States in connection with their publication, the fact that he later withdrew that. Now, today, the Obama administration at various levels has stated that the WikiLeaks publications threaten the lives and well-being of American diplomats around the world. They also present a threat to sources, individuals who've come forward and provided information to U.S. diplomats. They say that they undermine our ability to conduct diplomatic relations with nations around the world, and they threaten our military and our military's posture, so that they undermine the nation's security. So with that background, I'd like to start by focusing in on just one cable. And I'd like to look at a cable from December of 2009 issued by the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Japan. And this cable presents the embassy's concerns about the Japanese nuclear power industry. And at its core, it states that an international delegation from the IAEA had visited Japan, examined the reactors, and concluded and advised the Japanese government that it was extremely concerned about the safety of the principal nuclear reactor design, specifically focusing on a group of nuclear reactors located 100 miles north of Tokyo, which the inspectors concluded faced severe danger in the event of serious seismic activity. That information was not known to the people of Japan, was not known in the United States, came out as a result of the WikiLeaks publications, and I should note, came out as a result of its publication in England by the Telegraph, not by an American newspaper. So I'd like you to just let's look at this particular issue about nuclear safety, and let's weigh the pluses and minuses. You know, why did the U.S. government believe it should hold this secret, and did the world benefit net from this secrecy?
We can look at why the United States wanted this to be secret, undoubtedly to keep from embarrassing our ally. And why did it have to be kept secret in order not to embarrass the ally? Because nothing is more secret, I say as somebody who spent years in the government and more years as a consultant, nothing is more secret than evidence that later, retrospectively, would lead to accountability, which would lead to embarrassment, which would be a basis for blame, possibly for culpability, criminal prosecution, for losing office, for furnishing material to an ally, to a rival, not an ally, to a rival. Avoiding blame is sort of the major, number one principle of the bureaucracy, or of a politician, for that matter. So in this case, almost nothing is more secret than a warning within the government that a given policy which is going to be followed might be dangerous or criminal or wrong, reckless, especially in particular a warning that is rejected, that is ignored. If you can say, yes, we acted on that warning, I think the story, then it's not secret. You get credit for acting on it. I think the story you're quoting that I read said, a question might be raised as to whether the Japanese government's reaction to this, which was to do nothing, was adequate. Well, that question has an answer, actually, at this point, and it explains why information like that, of many nature, in national security and otherwise, has to be secret, even if at the time it looks harmless. It might turn out that the warning was right and it was ignored. It might turn out that the alternative policy that was proposed would have been better. And that is exactly what has most to be secret. I would say that most secrecy in all governments, but let me speak for our own, most secrecy is not directed at keeping secrets from external nations, enemies or allies or otherwise. It is to keep secrets from our American Congress, public courts. They're the ones who have the votes and who vote the budgets and who might possibly prosecute, and the ones whose blame is to be feared. So the Japanese would keep a similar warning to us, let's say, about British petroleum. They would nicely keep that secret for us, just as we wouldn't want that out. And of course, there were warnings. I've gotten so interested, having been involved in several major catastrophes of policy, specifically the Vietnam in particular, but also the buildup of our nuclear weapons over the years, a slow-running catastrophe, which hasn't fully been realized yet, but is nevertheless criminal in its recklessness. And it got me interested in catastrophes in general and how they come about. And one thing that's always said is, at the time that the disaster occurs, no one could have foreseen this. Or at least, no one did foresee it. I remember, for example, right after 9/11, Condoleezza Rice made the statement, no one could have imagined that planes would be used to fly into the World Trade Center. And Sibel Edmonds, who had then just left the FBI and was translator, and later around this time became known as the most gagged person in America by the use of the state secrets privilege against her, broke ranks on that one and said that as an FBI translator, she said that's an outrageous lie on television, and said that in fact there had been specific, what were regarded as authoritative informant reports of plans to fly planes into high buildings. As a matter of fact, so Condoleezza Rice had to say the next day, actually, I meant no word got to me of this. Not that it couldn't be imagined. Well, that was also a lie, but less easy to prove. And that's standard on all these things. So nothing in a way is more secret and bears secrecy stamps and is carefully guarded than indications of lack of unanimity behind the president's policy. Now, the enemy, if you have an enemy, doesn't care whether the policy was unanimous or not, or whether there were dissents or warning. That is nothing. What do they care? possibly. But in any case, I could give endless examples. I won't right now, except one that Charlie alluded to right now. Bradley Manning is discovered to be 23 hours a day with his exercise consisting of walking figure eights in a closed room for an hour a day when they release him from his shackles and then shackle him to take him back to his room. And Jeff Morrell, the Defense Department spokesperson, has said he gets adequate exercise, basketball, volleyball, tennis, whatever, it's a total flat lie. The president wants to say, and did say at his press conference, I have asked the Defense Department about his treatment and whether it's appropriate and meets our standards, and they have assured me that it is appropriate and meets our standards. Well, the president, in other words, doesn't want to take responsibility for that, for finding out, for investigating. He's willing to appear like a moron, this Harvard Law Review president, saying, I've been assured by the perpetrators here, just as Nixon could have said, I have asked the White House plumbers whether it was appropriate to go into Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and to attempt to incapacitate him totally, and they've assured me that this met our basic standards. And people might have laughed at that at the time. But what happens then when one official breaks ranks and tells the truth that there was a certain amount of dissent about this? P.J. Crowley, the spokesperson for the State Department, then says, I regard personally that, and at MIT, it wasn't at Harvard, at MIT, he says to 20 students, I regard the Defense Department behavior as ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. Now, he diplomatically, from the State Department, refrained from saying abusive and illegal, which it is, and which I'm sure he also believed, but just saying ridiculous, meaning there is not total agreement behind this policy. There is another point of view, is enough to get him fired within 24 hours out of his position. And so that's why people don't tell the truth and why truths like that must be kept secret.
Well, let's, so I guess P.J. Crowley committed the oldest mistake in Washington, which is speaking the truth. But
Sure, by the way, that it wasn't exactly a mistake because he was a very professional guy, worked for public affairs under Clinton as well as under this administration. He knew perfectly well, and when there happened to be a Neiman Fellow in the audience, a BBC reporter, who said, is that on the record? And I was struck in the transcript, it said, pause in the blog, long pause, and then he said, sure. He knew exactly, he wasn't making a mistake, he chose to give up his career in order to tell the truth.
Let's come to the question of government reaction to whistleblowers. You were, as best I can see, the first whistleblower prosecuted under the Espionage Act, under Section 793. And it seems there have been a few such instances afterwards, and in the most recent period since Barack Obama has come to power, we're seeing what must be the historical high tide of Espionage Act prosecutions. What's your sense of the dynamics? What is the Justice Department doing, bringing all of these prosecutions under the Espionage Act, as opposed to administrative actions for an individual's violating his secrecy obligations?
Well, it's a real puzzle, and actually I've asked people, and I asked you earlier, for a guess as to what's going on here. Because, to be specific on the statistics here, before Obama, there were exactly 3 prosecutions for unauthorized disclosure, that is, leaks. Mine was the first. And they're all under these parts of the Espionage Act, 18 U.S.C. 793, paragraphs D and E. And same charges that were brought against me. Now, prior to that time, for 60 years or so, since the act was passed, the act which was intended for espionage was used only for espionage, secretly giving information to a foreign power with intent to harm the United States or help a foreign power. The experiment then was done to see if that act could be used, and the language suggested that it could be used, against unauthorized disclosure to the American public. So I was the first. There was one 10 years later, Samuel Loring Morrison, 1984, who actually was the only person convicted by a jury on this case, and so it didn't go to the Supreme Court. It wasn't, I'm sorry, it was appealed, but cert was denied by the Supreme Court. A third case was the AIPAC case under George W. Bush, and that was dismissed by Obama, which seemed to some perhaps in accord with his promise of greater transparency and his praise of whistleblowers, who he said were courageous and necessary.
But it was after Judge
That wasn't
Ellis.
a whistleblower case, actually, but it was a case that would have had bad precedent for bringing other cases. So those were the three cases. Obama has brought 5 prosecutions, and he's looking into one for Assange, would be 6. That would be twice as many as all previous presidents put together in this first 2-year period. And the question is, what's going on? Why this? I haven't heard a real answer. He's against whistleblowers. I should say he's against leaks, but in effect, that means being against whistleblowers, despite his promises. But all presidents have been. He's not the first to be outraged by leaks. In fact, Bush and his subordinates, Rumsfeld and Cheney and others, spoke of prosecutions of people for the NSA warrantless wiretap leaks, for example, for which the New York Times got a Pulitzer Prize. And other cases, the CIA black sites and the renditions and the torture. They were going to investigate all of those leaks, which we got only from leaks, unauthorized disclosures. We wouldn't have known them otherwise, but they didn't indict. 3 of the 5 cases here we're talking about were for acts done under Bush, in which Bush had, in several of the cases, like Thomas Drake, plenty of time to indict and did not choose to indict, and Obama has indicted. So much for his not looking back. That applies to torture by, or war crimes, crimes against the peace, rendition, other things, by the Bush administration, the warrantless wiretaps. We won't look back, we'll only look forward. But he is looking back, and only against whistleblowers that Bush didn't indict. So it's a total reversal of his promise.
Dan, let's take a second and let's look at the Drake case. I think this is one that's probably going to go to trial in June, so it's coming up very soon.
I saw June 13th, June 13th, that would be the 40th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers.
I think that's right.
Coming up.
And this is a case that comes out of the NSA. And moreover, Thomas Drake, you were the first recipient of the Reidenauer Prize. And Thomas Drake, I see, has now been selected to receive this year's Reidenauer Prize. So he seems to stand very much in your tradition. Maybe you want to give us a little bit of background about the
just
case.
one thing. The reason it's named for Ron Reidenauer, who was an army trooper who became aware that his unit, while he was away from it on a long-range patrol, had conducted the My Lai massacre. And he was so horrified by what he heard from people that he'd admired, some of his friends who'd taken part in that, that he decided to expose it, and in the end sent letters to every member of Congress exposing it, which didn't lead to much, actually. He also, Cy Hirsch got onto it and eventually got the Pulitzer Prize for exposing the My Lai massacre. But Reidenauer was crucial in having tracked down people who were involved in sending the testimony in. So a friend of his, Randy Fertel, has established an award for truth-telling. 3 awards given a year. It's a very nice award because it has money with it, which is quite unusual. And usually getting an award means that you give a lecture free and you get a scroll. So this is very nice. It actually has some money, and which Drake needs very much. He can really use that money because, having used up all of his savings trying to avert prosecution under Bush, successfully actually, now he has no savings left and has a public defender at this point, and can undoubtedly use help. This audience, keep that in mind. So clear, you wanted to talk more about a clear whistleblower case, but they are giving him, there's 3 prizes, and one is for actions during the year, which he's getting, and another is for a book, and the third is a lifetime kind of courage award, which I got.
Now,
Cy Hirsch got, actually.
That's correct. Yeah, so he, in his case, he was a senior figure at the NSA. He was responsible for, hired and brought in to think outside of the box. He's told he reviewed some very sensitive programs that the NSA was working on with contractors, on which the NSA had spent enormous sums of money, became convinced of fraud, mismanagement, and abuse, and began raising issues about them. How does this lead them being prosecuted?
Well, he did raise it, having tried every possible channel and testified about it before Congress and getting no results whatever from a program which he said not only was $1.5 billion boondoggle, which was sure to fail and did fail, was not fun, but also which did not preserve any of the protections of the Fourth Amendment, which he said could easily have been satisfied by a different program which cost much less and would have protected privacy. But instead, the NSA chose this other one, and in the end did not choose the cheaper one, instead went with one that did not protect privacy. So he did the channel that he should have done. He revealed this to the press, public, in hopes of getting some action on that, and was caught. There's a bizarre aspect to that. Well, one thing was, he did take a precaution of, at one point, after he used, as I say, every other channel, Inspector General, Congress, everything, he tried to use a Canadian company that that promised perfect privacy of your communications, which he used to the Baltimore Sun. And what the fine print in their advertising didn't say was, except to the FBI, which has a backdoor to all of their communications.
This is
and the
hush
NSA.
mail, by the way, just
What?
in case any of you are thinking of
what?
hush mail.
Hush mail, yeah,
Just in
right.
case any of you are thinking of using
So
it.
he didn't use WikiLeaks, in short. Very simply, that's not a joke. If he'd used WikiLeaks, he would not be on trial. And the day may come when that's the only way of getting this information out. But a bizarre thing has happened just in the last couple days. The first headline was in Steve Aftergood's Secrecy News, which is a very good source on all these matters. Secrecy News, Federation of American Sciences project on secrecy, revealed that the Defense Department, the NSA rather, has reclassified 2 letters that were in the public record that were part of his defense. And they put them in the defense. And they have reclassified, and the point being that these were letters that they claimed were classified, that they had found in his house when they searched it. So he's putting them in to say, but this is not a classification at all. They were not properly classified. When I read what we're talking about, I could hardly believe my eyes. This was just this morning. They're talking about the designation FOUO, for official use only. And that is not a classification. It's a designator, meaning don't hand this out to the first journalist you see, practically. It's below confidential. It is not part of the classification system. For them to call this classification is absurd to anybody who's had a clearance or who's been in the system. It just means don't give this to the other party if you can avoid it, the other Republican or Democratic Party. So they've reclassified it, they said, as FOUO. Well, as Aftergood points out, the classification rules actually state nothing classified is to be designated for official use only. It is to be used only on unclassified material. What's happening, just take my word for it, it's a ridiculous situation. And it really exemplifies the fact that under both Bush and now under Obama, who is continuing in every respect the secrecy policies of the Bush administration, which were extraordinary for their time and have now been surpassed in many ways. In every respect, they are multiplying new classifications, supposed classifications, making virtually a Chinese system, where everything that you haven't handed out at a press conference is to be regarded as secret.
Including unclassified materials,
There's no,
I think.
in effect, they're almost saying there's no such thing as unclassified. Everything is secret. And that's the preferred stance of any government in the world. Now, most of them don't pretend to be democratic, but no government wants to be second-guessed, wants to be subject to blame in any respect. And what this piece of paper might look absolutely harmless today, but maybe a year from now won't look so harmless, or the next, when it's been found out that it was a totally criminal operation, or just that it failed, that the British Petroleum wasn't taking all the precautions.
Well, let's look at what consequence do you see for this legal strategy of intensified prosecutions under the Espionage Act? What consequences does this have for the public's right to know? Specifically, let's start with journalists, for journalists' ability to receive this information and publish it. Do you see a change there?
Most officials and most journalists believe that we now have the equivalent of an Official Secrets Act. And they've always believed that, and I believed that when I was in the government. When I was copying the Pentagon Papers, I assumed I must be breaking some law.
And you're referring to the British statute, the Official Secrets
The British
Act.
Official Secrets Act, the essence of which, and we don't have one. As I say, I've talked to audiences now of full-scale lawyers and journalists, but also judges in the past, and asked them if they were aware what this meant, that we didn't have a British Official Secrets Act, or the fact that we didn't have one. That makes it illegal, criminalizes any unauthorized release to any unauthorized person of any material protected by the government that's kept from public distribution.
So a publisher cannot
Stamp.
publish it, a broadcaster cannot broadcast it.
Yeah, and they're breaking the law. Yeah, they're breaking the law if they do. It criminalizes any or all. Now, we have 3 narrow Official Secrets Act. What amount? Because the Supreme Court, despite what Black and Douglas decried as misreading the First Amendment, which says Congress shall pass no law, and they said, well, no law means no law. But most judges have gone along with the idea, okay, if the law is narrow enough, and if it's the clear intent of Congress that this must be abridged in a narrow way, that it can be done if they can justify it, in terms that the benefit of concealing it outweighs the benefit of revealing it. And those particular narrow laws have to do with restricted data, which is nuclear weapons design data mainly, and stockpile data. Second, communications intelligence, codes, code breaking, and the contents, in some cases, of the intercepted communications. And third, the identities of covert agents of the CIA. That came up in the Plame case, the revelation of the name of Valerie Plame, who was a clandestine agent. And by the way, I don't object to those laws. I think there's an example. People ask me, should there be any secrets? Broadly speaking, these 3 narrow areas, it's hard to say whether they're narrow. It's really a lot of information when you're saying communications intelligence. But relative to the whole classification system, it's very narrow. And it's at a higher level than top secret. You have to have a top secret clearance on the whole to have this other access.
But
okay, I don't object to that.
Now, in
But the
1999...
question is, does anything else? The Pentagon Papers did not involve any of these, did not involve nuclear weapons data, communications, identities of clandestine agents. But it was 7,000 pages of top secret documents. And as Leonard Boudin said, giving 7,000 pages of the top secret documents to the New York Times has a bad ring to it. Even if it's not, as we had come to find, clearly against the law. And I was just reminding Charlie that even years later, but not now, when I asked him, Charlie is my lawyer, did I break the law? And his answer then was, I don't know. It's not clear. It's a very difficult question. And that actually remains, it's even more difficult now in some respects. The arguments for saying no law was broken, remain strong. But the tendency has been, on the other hand, to say, forget the legislative history, forget the fact that the Congress did not want the Espionage Act to be an Official Secrets Act. They actually rejected it at the time. And they said, we don't want a British-type Official Secrets Act because it keeps too much information out of public discussion. We're willing to keep, as later, communications intelligence, we're willing to keep nuclear weapons data out of public discussion. But everything that's stamped, secret, top secret, confidential, too much. Moreover, most of it, a lot of it is information we, the Congress, need to know in order to pass a budget, to have any information the public needs to know in knowing who to vote or how to judge foreign policy. If we are, in Madison's words, people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And popular government without popular information is but the prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. And that's the principle on which we fought a war of independence.
What about the measure that Congress brought up in 1999, approved in 2000, that went to President Clinton? I mean, it looks there like Congress was trying to craft something like the Official Secrets Act.
Exactly, they did. In fact, the conservative, Robert Barr, who identified it as an Official Secrets Act, and said, you don't want this. Actually, it was initially proposed or balanced by Janet Reno. So the Democrats voted for it on a voice vote with no discussion, no debate, really, except for a handful of people. Nancy Pelosi opposed it, Barr opposed it. Went up to the president, at which point the press woke up and said, hey, you've just passed an Official Secrets Act for the first time. Now, if that Clinton proceeded to veto it, despite Janet Reno's proposal earlier. He now said it. We didn't give it enough consideration earlier. And he quoted the Pentagon Papers case and Potter Stewart and why you needed the information. We don't want an Official Secrets Act. So he vetoed it. This president would not veto it since 9/11. And it probably will go up to him again. If we have an Official Secrets Act then passed by Congress with the intent of Congress, this Supreme Court, especially in contrast to perhaps 40 years ago, Black and Douglas are not there anymore, this Supreme Court would probably find those clauses either of 793 constitutional or this act constitutional. And in the case of the act, the fact that it has congressional intention behind it gives it much more weight as being acceptable under the First Amendment. The difference that will make is this. Until now, the real question is not so much why are there 5 cases being brought now, but why so few cases in the past? And the answer is no law. You didn't have a law that was clearly constitutional. That's what I believe gave Charlie his problem then. The wording of 793 D&E did seem to apply very clearly, but it didn't look constitutional. If the Supreme Court finds one of these cases constitutional or there's an act that's passed, then what will happen is that every time there is a leak, like the CIA camps, like the total deception that preceded the Iraq War, which was leaked only after the war had started by Richard Clark and others, unfortunately. There was no Bradley Manning in the high levels of government to leak that before the war started and avert the war. So if the torture camps and so forth, all of those things which we know only from leaks, from whistleblowing, all they would have to do, instead of doing what Ashcroft and Bush were saying, we're having a big FBI investigation, we're trying to find out who did this, they just go to James Risen of the New York Times, Eric Lichtblau, or the others, and they say, we're not after you. You're a journalist. We regard you as free press here. We're not after you. Just tell us who committed the crime. Because they don't have a clear-cut crime with a constitutional backing. And they'll say, if they say, well, I can't, it's my source, I can't do that. Say, you're not exempt as a journalist from the duty of any citizen who knows a crime has been committed to tell us who committed it. So tell us who leaked it.
So
they won't have to do any investigation. They'll have it.
Tell me how WikiLeaks as a mechanism addresses this problem.
Well, WikiLeaks was meant to facilitate whistleblowing world over, and Assange, Julian Assange, who started it, said from the beginning and has said till now, the number one target he had in mind was China, and that he was getting a lot of stuff from Chinese bloggers. The problem was how to deal with it in a way that would not expose them. Now, in China, yes, I found when I was in China once, in the situation, everything's secret. A guy was in prison for having broken the embargo on a speech that was to be delivered. And he delivered it, he reported on it in Hong Kong before the speech was delivered. He's in prison for years. That's a wonderful example for any bureaucrat, any official. I'm sure that all of our officials are quite jealous of that system. Well, Assange wanted, especially, he said, that's the kind, he said, hierarchical authoritarian governments are the one he believes, question in my mind, I'm not sure I agree with him, are most vulnerable to this kind of leaking. So he wanted to do it. When I say I have a question, the question really arises, you can leak, but what happens? You know, people have to be able to act on it in some way. I don't know exactly what they do in China. If they had the information, they could do what people in Egypt did or in Libya, and they could get treated maybe more like Libya than Egypt. But in any case, he was looking at China, he was looking at Kenya, where there was great corruption, and other countries. And the idea was that using the new characteristics of computers, which I scarcely understand on this point, I rely on my son for this stuff, to do my tweeting for me entirely, that he could do it anonymously. And when they proposed that I be on the advisory board when he was starting this, I thought that this proposal he described, we're going to leak all over the world, you know, and so we want you to be our #1 advisor. And I thought, boy, this is an obvious CIA ploy here. You know. Send us your leaks, you're tired, you're poor, you know, and so forth. And we'll take care of them, you know, no problem. And so I thought, this is silly. And if it is sincere, I don't believe they can beat NSA. You know, they're trying to break, so they succeed in breaking Soviet codes. How are they? Well, it turns out apparently they can give even NSA trouble with the worldwide globalized servers here and networks and so forth, that NSA can be given some trouble on this. And in fact, WikiLeaks has over the last 4 years, put out a lot of leaks from other countries. These are the first American ones they've done. And none of their people have been found, actually. So they are able to promise anonymity, what Thomas Drake didn't get. And Bradley Manning, unfortunately, got on a chat log on the computer and talked to somebody who informed on him quickly, but it wasn't WikiLeaks. Allegedly, really. We really know nothing except chat logs. In Wired magazine, they printed 20% of the chat logs they have. They refuse to print any of the others. And Adrian Lameau is not the most reliable person, let me say euphemistically here. So we really don't know. However, giving the benefit of the doubt to Bradley, if he is the person, we don't even know if he was on the other end of those chat logs or whether they've been fixed or not. But when I read a guy quoted as saying, I'm ready to go to prison for life or even be executed in order to get this out, I thought, I haven't heard that from anybody for 40 years. And that's the way I felt 40 years ago. And it seemed to me an appropriate way to feel when you're talking about shortening wars and avoiding atrocities. And it's puzzled me, one of the puzzles I've had in 40 years is why there haven't been more Bradley Mannings. It's easy to see, listen to the way they're treating him. They're doing what they can to deter. They're bringing charges up against him that could involve execution and life sentence. In my case, 115 years. So that was meant to slow people down from following the example. Well, it did, and that's understandable. But why nobody? Actually, that still puzzles me. I can see why there wouldn't be a lot of people, but why did it take 40 years for somebody to be willing to go that far and do it? Because we're talking about ultimate stakes here. I don't actually have the answer to that. But in any case, with this new thing by Obama, it's new since Bush, to press the law this way, and as I say, the laws that are coming along in Congress are likely to be signed by this president, then we will have far fewer leaks. And we'll have a government by handout. You'll know what they want you to know, what the government, and that really means no democratic participation in foreign policy or homeland security policy. It means basically, we can go even more into that, the opacity of the government, which this promotes, combined with total transparency of the public, with the legitimation by legislation of, which Obama ended up signing, of warrantless wiretapping, so that the government can know everything about you, your email, your faxes, your credit cards, your bank statement, everything that's on electronic, and can use that information to blackmail people into being informants, as in East Germany. If you've seen the movie, how many people have seen the movie The Lives of Others? Okay, well, most of you. The others see it. And you'll see a key aspect there that the information they were gathering was used to get other people to give them information that was not written down, not digitally transmitted, information that was from the bed or the kitchen of your closest associates. That can happen here. We have the infrastructure now of a police state. And it's happening. It's Senator Frank Church in '76 said, "I've seen the abilities of the NSA," which I knew. I had the clearances then for NSA. And I had the same fear the Church had. If this is ever turned on our own public, we will not have a democracy. You can't have a democracy. Well, it has been turned. Church called that is the abyss we must never cross, and the abyss from which there is no return. We've crossed the abyss. That has happened. First covertly under Bush, clearly illegally. The New York Times gets the story, ready to publish it before the election, showing that the president, before the election, was flatly lying when he said, "We do no wiretaps without a warrant," as the Fourth Amendment, as interpreted by the courts, applying it to communications in general, demands a warrant. He said, "Nothing without a warrant," a flat lie. The New York Times has that information before the election of 2004. That was a very close election. I find it hard to believe that wouldn't have swung a few hundred, a few thousand votes in Ohio or elsewhere. And I think the Times gave us 4 more years of George W. Bush by holding that back because the White House asked them to.
Dan, we're down to our last couple of minutes. I'd like to bring you back to the same point we started with, Bradley Manning. He was arrested in May of last year. He's been held in unusual circumstances, to put it mildly. You've been following the situation very closely. I'd like you to track that back against your own experience 40 years ago. How has the government gone about using its amazing powers against this whistleblower as compared with your own experience?
Well, I was a civilian, subject to civilian law. He's military, so he's in a military brig. And whatever his 793 charge comes out, and I would hope that it would be found unconstitutional if it goes to the Supreme Court or in any of these cases. But there are other charges against him which they may or may not be able to prove, of breaking military regulations. And he may have done so. We don't know. If they can prove it, they could get him in jail for a long time just for downloading material that they found on his computer that shouldn't have been on his computer. They apparently have not been able to prove that he sent any of it to WikiLeaks, if he did. So that's why I think they're squeezing him very hard. What is the purpose of torture? The purpose is not to get intelligence information. The purpose is to get confessions, especially false confessions. Or the confession you want, true or false, fine, either way, but a confession that you want. The people who were waterboarded, which even the president admits he agreed to. Cheney has admitted he agreed to. They've also agreed it's torture. That means they've admitted in writing in their memoirs to a crime, to a clear-cut crime, which Obama is not looking backward to, but which is his obligation to investigate and pursue. Okay, why were they waterboarding these 2 people in particular? Because they wanted confessions that Saddam Hussein, this was in 2002 now, that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11 and was in close association with Al-Qaeda. Now, Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush probably believed that was true. They certainly hoped it was true because it would be the basis for what they wanted to do, which was to attack Iraq. It happens it wasn't true, which actually brings out a very interesting thing. 183 waterboardings did not get that out of them. It seems that torture isn't perfectly guaranteed to get what you want, even when you do it. But they didn't get that, so they had to go ahead without that basic evidence. But that's what it's for. When the Chinese did it, when the North Koreans did it, when the North Vietnamese did it, it's to get confessions. And in this case, false confessions. So what they want out of Bradley Manning is information that will tie Assange to what he did in some way that will look conspiratorial. Now, strictly speaking, the idea, when the New York Times got the Pentagon Papers from me, I didn't slip it 7,000 pages over a transom. You know, or over. Did they help get it? Well, actually, Sheehan actually copied them from me after promising that he wouldn't copy them.
The statute of limitations
Yeah,
is run.
that could be called conspiracy. I never blamed him for it. I figured I'd done the same. So it was in the cause of getting this information out. I didn't hold it against him. But could they have gone against? There's nothing that they can go against Assange that is not equally applicable to the New York Times and all the other newspapers, as Charlie said, that came out with this.
So we are out of time for this portion. We have another 15 minutes for Q&A for your questions. At 6:15, Scott Horton has to go. He's got a taxi waiting for him, and we thank him very much for his time. So he'll slip out at 6:15. We'll try and end right at about that time.
Randy, going at 6:30? Are we going to 6:30?
We can go a bit more with you,
With me, yeah.
but Scott Horton is going to leave at 6:15, and I'm just... So we will finish up at 6:30 for sure. Let's take some questions. Take a couple of questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions at once, and then get your comments on the questions. So let's see. We've got one here and one there. Let's take those 2 to start, and maybe we'll get another one afterwards. You, yes, sir, please.
Yeah, there are several stories on the internet that President Obama has connections with the CIA. His whole family was involved in. Any information on that?
I have a hearing problem. So I may have to.
President Obama and his family have connections with the CIA.
Yeah, we're going to cluster the questions.
He runs
Mr.
the
Ellsberg.
CIA.
Let's cluster the questions and get your responses. One here.
I wondered if you could comment on the contents of the WikiLeaks disclosures relating to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and how, if at all, it's influenced public opinion on the war in the United States.
So I just happened to know that was Deborah Popowski. What I should have said before, please state your name and any institutional affiliation you care to mention before your question. Deborah Popowski at Harvard Law School. Okay, you, sir.
Jesus, the content of
I heard that.
Thanks. I want to start by seconding the appreciation for Lenny Weinglass, who also did some very important work on behalf of Lamia Abu-Jamal, who remains on death row in Pennsylvania. My question is, I didn't read the 7,000 pages of Pentagon Papers. It's still one of my ambitions before I die. I think just like most people didn't read much of the Pentagon Papers, I think most people probably haven't read much at all of WikiLeaks. We rely on interlocutors who maybe working in specialized areas, pick out the things that they have found, and then that's how I hear about the Palestinian piece of it, for example. What are, in your view, either of you, the most important revelations that you've encountered so far in this mass of information? And more specifically, who have you found are some of the best interlocutors or the best mechanisms for doing the editing that otherwise we would be at a loss?
So let's start with those questions, and then maybe we'll go to a second block.
That last one is very similar to yours. The one thing that's important to say is that the word that's come out very much and prejudiced people against, I think, WikiLeaks and Manning very much, is the notion that they dumped a lot of stuff indiscriminately and without any concern for what it revealed. It was not political. It was not motivated by reform or anything like that. That's false. The most question has been about the 260,000 state cables, which is a very large number. Obviously, very unlikely that Manning or whoever it was, the source, could have read them all. And certainly I would not advise someone to put out a lot of information, secret or not, that you hadn't read. I don't believe in total transparency in the government, and I would want to have read it. But in terms of what has been revealed, I'm actually quite surprised at how much substance has been revealed, though not on the whole in the New York Times, elsewhere. The Guardian coverage has been very good. Der Spiegel has been good. When you say what are some specific things that are really struck me, the number one actually was the revelation that Ann Patterson, the ambassador in Pakistan, had reported that whereas the Pentagon and the government had been saying that we're doing no ground offensive operations in Pakistan, that we did have special forces there, but they were only, quote, training trainers. They were not training troops, they were training people to train troops. So there were two removes, actually, from actual operations. And Patterson revealed in these cables, in fact, for several years, the special forces have been doing independent offensive ground operations in Pakistan. Now that just hit me in the head, knocked me over on two grounds. Not just that there was deception about it, which is to be expected, but on the one hand, there was the analogy to Vietnam of the war bleeding into another country as we went into Cambodia and Laos. In other words, expanding, or as an official said at the time, Marshall Green, in paraphrasing Nixon's statement, he was winding down the war. And Marshall Green said, we're widening down the war. And I was always been sure that the war in Afghanistan, with all this talk of sanctuaries and borders and whatnot, was inevitably the logic of that if you were going for the unattainable goal of victory or of prevailing in some sense, was going to expand the war into Pakistan, as in Vietnam. So now Patterson is telling me, for the first time, that it has happened. It's not just something in the future. It has happened under Obama. But something far more serious than was the case in Vietnam. First of all, the whole war in Afghanistan and in Iraq threatens us at home in a way. This futile, hopeless, wrongful war threatens us in a way because the Viet Cong and the Hanoi government did not ever choose to retaliate with terror attacks in the U.S., which is now clearly part of international relations, you might say, or the defense of their own territory. So it is endangering us. It's lowering security by claiming to pursue security in other people's countries, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Pakistan is far more dangerous even than Afghanistan or Iraq. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and they are under the potential control of their inter-service intelligence unit there, which is a great coup prospect.
It's the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world, in fact.
The what?
The fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world
right.
is in Pakistan.
Which, by the way, we turned a, quote, blind eye to during the years when they were building up a Islamic jihad against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And we were paying for that in Pakistan. So we were giving them money, which in fact they diverted to use of their nuclear weapons program, which is extremely dangerous. But the inter-service, who for our purposes created the Taliban and is closely associated with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which is mainly headquartered in Pakistan now, not in Afghanistan. In fact, I saw Gates the other day said the estimate of 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan for 100,000 plus troops over there, 50 to 100. But they're in Pakistan. If our ground offensive operations there added to our drone operations, which have made us not just disfavored by the Pakistanis, but hated by the Pakistani government, as they say in polls, hated, that's a very dangerous attitude in people who have this problematic, large, growing number of weapons, nuclear weapons, allied potentially to Al-Qaeda. I would say that the policy of destabilizing the Pakistan government in order to say we killed so many terrorists last week by our drone attacks and by our ground offensive operations, which is what Gates and Obama are boasting about, knowing from their own intelligence that that is creating terrorists faster than we're killing them, but in the short run, we're killing them. We're destabilizing a government now that could put nuclear weapons in the hands of Al-Qaeda. I'm not being rhetorical here or partisan. I voted for Obama. And I could, if I were in a close state like Florida, I would vote for him again in 2012 against the likely opposition, in the face of the fact that I see this as the most reckless, irresponsible policy I can imagine. In fact, I mentioned this to Noam Chomsky last night. I said, I can't imagine what we could do that is more reckless and irresponsible. And Noam said, well, how about sending a CIA killer over to Pakistan to shoot 2 people on their streets?
And the two
Named
people who,
I said, oh, yeah, well.
the 2 people who were shot on the streets were in fact ISI agents, by the way.
Were what?
Were ISI agents. They were Pakistani
Okay.
intelligence agents.
So, all right, it's a little competition going here as to what can we do next today to most endanger the United States and so forth. So that's what they're running in there. I thought Bush was, took the title for life. But no, it hasn't been retired.
Dan, if I could, let me just bring up a couple of other things, because I think the reporting about the WikiLeaks, the substance of the WikiLeaks cables, and American media, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, was basically just move on there. There's nothing interesting to see. We've reported the essence of this already. If you look at coverage overseas, you see how it has really had dramatic impact in nation after nation, and by and large, that impact hasn't even been reported in the United States. And I just start with what happened in Tunisia, where the Arab Revolution of 2011 began. Everybody knows about the self-immolation of a vegetable vendor, but actually one of the key triggering incidents there was the publication of cables that came out of the Tunis embassy, which described the extensive kleptocracy of the Tunisian regime. Wasn't a surprise to people in Tunisia, but it was taken as absolute ratification of what they believed about the fundamental corruption of their government. It helped propel that revolution. Then let's step across to Egypt, where there was another revolution. Again, publication of WikiLeaks cables from the embassy in Cairo describing the corruption of the Mubarak regime, talking about the close relations between the CIA and the Mubarak regime, and particularly Omar Suleiman, the man Mubarak was trying to position to be his successor, and the torture by proxy regime in Egypt. All things that contributed to inflaming the situation there, leading to a revolution. Not bad things in my book, by the way. I think it contributed to positive change. Let's look at Spain, where a series of cables were published showing how the U.S. Embassy had tried to undermine the Spanish criminal justice system. Long series of cables talking about how diplomats and political figures from the United States met with Spanish officials trying to arrange for the removal or withdrawal or replacement of judges and prosecutors in order to block the pending criminal investigation into the torture of a Spanish citizen at Guantanamo and the investigation of the so-called Bush Six, that is the 6 lawyers in the Bush administration responsible for the torture regime. On the 27th of February, the Audiencia Nacional, the Spanish National Security Court, issued a special decision upholding its jurisdiction and determining to go forward with those prosecutions. Why? One of the senior prosecutors told me, impossible for them to reach any other decision after the WikiLeaks cables, because it would have looked like the United States had subverted their criminal justice system. And in Germany, where cables disclosed, again, exactly the same thing. American diplomats working, trying to undermine a pending German criminal investigation into the torture and abduction of a German citizen, Khalid al-Masri, who was seized, abused, and tortured in the salt pit in Afghanistan on the basis of what? Mistaken identity. He had a name that sounded like the name of a senior al-Qaeda agent. And again, that criminal investigation was blocked after prosecutors had issued 13 arrest warrants against CIA agents, one of whom is now the head of the CIA's al-Qaeda unit, who can't get on an airplane and go to Europe today for fear of being arrested if she does. So these are just some examples. We can go country after country after country where similar things have happened. And I would say there's not a single case where I see these disclosures have threatened the safety of a diplomat or undermine any legitimate U.S. interests or security interests. But they have actually contributed to a bit of justice.
And some people have. Did you go to Harvard? A credit if you have. Another question?
So if we can, since it's just about 6:15, and Scott Horton is going to have to go. So if you'll join me, please, in another round of applause for Scott for his participation. And then what we'll be able to do is have another round of questions. I'll ask you, please, if you can state your name, affiliation, and be concise, because that way we'll have more time for the responses from Mr. Ellsberg. So let's start here in the back. You, sir, please.
My name is Alan Rosen, I'm a Harvard Law student. My question for you, sir, is do you believe that in order to get real transparency into important issues, we will always have to have whistleblowers delivering large amounts of information to outside organizations? Or do you think there could be some institutional changes in the government that would allow either a freer flow of classified information or less pervasive overclassification of that information?
We'll take a few questions. So all the way in the back, if you could step up to a microphone, please, to press the button, affiliation, and a concise question.
David Whitmer, I'm a Harvard Law student. I was wondering, I mean, obviously there are folks who admire PhD Manning for what he did, and certainly Julian Assange, but to me their actions don't seem to approach your own, given that you are so much closer to what was actually going on and to the actions which you disclosed, from being there on the night of the Tonkin Gulf attacks, all the way through. What do you think it would take for more people on the inside to take these kinds of actions, and why do you think it didn't happen, especially during the Bush administration?
So that's the second question. We'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, hello, Nancy Murray from the ACLU of Massachusetts, and I'd like you to comment on what seems a massive contradiction. On the one hand, they want to shut down any kind of leaks, but on the other hand, we now have, according to the Washington Post, 850,000 people with top secret security clearance, and we have about 800,000 police, law enforcement agents, and other law enforcement personnel who are able to feed information in and get information from this massive domestic surveillance network that has been set up with fusion centers and so on. Doesn't that make leaks and all sorts of blackmail and all sorts of nefarious deeds absolutely inevitable?
So there are the questions. Enjoy.
No. In this sense, it might seem so. How can you keep secrets, with 800,000 top secret, hundreds of thousands, millions even of others who have beyond that? How it may seem implausible. They know better. They do keep the secrets. They know every day the secrets of the lying that was going on in Iraq. I'm sorry, with respect to Iraq, from 9/11 on. Richard Clark was in the White House, has said that on 9/11, 9/12, he was already hearing from Rumsfeld the intention to use this as an excuse to attack Iraq, which, as Clark, who was head of counterterrorism, said to him, but Iraq had nothing to do with it, and attacking another Muslim country, oil-rich country, for that obvious reason, will spur the recruiting for al-Qaeda to such an extent that counterterrorism will be impossible. The war against terror will be lost. He knew that on 9/12. And Rumsfeld said, but there are no good targets in Afghanistan. We're going to go anyway. Clark did not speak up, even when he was testifying before Congress later. As he said later, if I had told the truth, which he did tell, eventually in 2004, to his credit, and I'm glad he did, but the war was at that point a year old. We were well into it. When he was asked why he hadn't said this earlier, he said, I would have been fired before I got back to my office. He didn't say, by the way, I'd be prosecuted. He might or might not. But I would have been fired, and that's probably true. But should that be the last word? Well, to be fired in order to avert a war. Well, the answer is, it is sufficient for virtually everybody. Consider the fact that hundreds of thousands of people had access to the same information we've been talking about, and we could go on a lot more than I've said before. The 15,000 extra dead in Iraq that were not in the Iraq body count. The huge use on a vast scale of assassination squads in Afghanistan. And the case in Pakistan of Ray Davis is obviously just one more of those. Pardon me. The use of torture, which the president said he'd ended, by Iraqis to whom we were handing over suspects, are giving them those suspects when we knew they were going to be tortured, is a direct violation of law. And the orders were, do not investigate further. Hundreds of thousands of people had access to those reports. One reported it. I wouldn't call that inevitable. And of course, they're doing what they can to make sure there's not one other. With the Pentagon Papers, people said, well, in our system, because you can't resign, actually Thomas Frank and Weisband wrote a book and said, we should have a system like the British that allows people to resign and tell why they resigned, in Parliament, and without any restraint of secrecy. If you don't have that, which we don't have, you inevitably get an Ellsberg. And I remember, a rogue is what they said, actually. And I remember, every 40 years or so, you get an Ellsberg. They can live with that, is the answer to that. The amazing thing is that they are able to keep these secrets with enormous numbers of people. There used to be a saying in Washington, when you're talking about really high secrets, which are of a different category, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. But the truth is, that's a myth. The truth is they keep secrets very well that are known to hundreds of thousands of people. At the time of the Pentagon Papers, what I knew in my safe, I believe, had I given it to Senator Morse, as he later told me, would have prevented the Vietnam War. He said it would never have gotten out of committee, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and if it had, it would never have been voted down. Well, it's a heavy load to bear. But at the time, I hadn't thought of doing such a thing, and yet later I thought, well, that's an exaggeration. Johnson would have found some other excuse for Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Then I reflected, no, if I'd given the full contents of my safe, it takes more than 5 pages or 10 pages. It takes a drawer full, 1,000 pages, several thousand pages, that show the extent of the lying, the extent of the knowledge of what you're doing, the guilty knowledge. What did the president know and when did he know it? A lot on that. That's what the Pentagon Papers showed. If I'd done that in '64, Johnson would have still won the election because the alternative was Goldwater. It's like Obama's rival in 2012 or 2008. He would have won the election, but not with a landslide against Goldwater. And he could not have escalated the war at that time. So it's very heavy. Had Clark come out with what he knew, and now he's one person, he was at the top, but there were hundreds of people, if not thousands, who knew enough to have averted the Iraq War. Bradley Manning, somebody asked, wasn't he in a different position from me? Unfortunately, yes. He did not have access to the high-level decision-making stuff that I had. On the other hand, mine was at least 3 years old when it finally came out. His was current under Obama as well as under Bush. And it was low level. It was, in fact, so low level that I wouldn't have had time to read it in the Pentagon, literally. I would have missed quite a bit, it turns out. But his stuff was so level, but it actually had the characteristic that it revealed war crimes, like the torture I've just described, clear-cut war crime. That means blame, culpability for people who were still in office. That really has to be they really have to stop that. So Bradley Manning put that out. If he'd had the high-level stuff, I'm sure he would have put that out. As he said, he was ready to go to prison for life. An Official Secrets Act would not have stopped him. As of course, it didn't stop me. I thought there was one, and I went ahead anyway. But it stops most people. Somebody asked about the institutional aspects of this. Ideally, I don't think you can do a lot institutionally because every hierarchical institution demands loyalty and demands, above all, silence about its embarrassing crimes, deceptions, recklessness, mistakes, blames, everything. Unions, certainly corporations for sure, governments, all governments. Very hard to do. You can establish whistleblowing channels in there, but they don't usually work. The key thing is to get it to outsiders, and you can't do that without risk. Now, you don't need the risk of prosecution to keep too many secrets. The Catholic Church was abusing children on a vast scale, the hierarchy, or the priests, and covering it up. How many thousands of priests and bishops knew about that? Not one was a whistleblower. Were they afraid of prosecution? No, they didn't want to hurt the institution. They didn't want to hurt their careers. They didn't want to hurt their image as loyal members of that institution. How about the tobacco company people? How many knew that the corporation executives who swore before Congress, 7 of them, we have no knowledge that our product is either, this was in several separate oaths, carcinogenic, addictive, or that we're selling it to minors. Actually, they had a vast amount of documentary evidence that they knew exactly that. 2 people blew the whistle on that. 2 out of tens of thousands who knew that, in a situation which is killing 500,000 Americans a year. In other words, we have a society, it isn't just institutions, that believes in loyalty as represented by secrecy, by silence, by obedience to promises that should not be kept, because these are promises of secrecy that are protecting massacre, protecting wars, protecting crimes, protecting child abuse, protecting damage to the public, to consumers and whatnot. They obviously should not be kept, and yet people have no embarrassment whatever about saying, I couldn't tell, I'd promised not to tell, I had to keep that promise. And it's true, their careers depend on it. Their image depends on it. To tell, and come back to the question earlier, can we make it, I'll take it, could we change the institutions to make it safer? You can't do too much to protect whistleblowers from losing their jobs, their careers, their income and whatnot. Most whistleblowers do. I was very lucky. Well, I did lose the career, such as it was, but I didn't have my marriage destroyed by loss of income and so forth. Nixon made me sufficiently famous, notorious, that I was able to make a living as a lecturer. That's almost unique, actually, among whistleblowers, so I was lucky there. But people do pay a price. The question is whether what's happening now under Obama, we should add to all those sanctions what does not exist in the corporations, in the auto companies, in the Vioxx manufacturers, in the pharmaceuticals, and none of them, the whistleblowers, are deterred by threat of prosecution because it doesn't come up. They're not called traitors. It's still enough to keep them from telling. But in the national security apparatus, they want now to add something that we got away from in the American Revolution, and that is add the threat of prosecution for telling the state secrets. And I said, really, only one man so far has been convicted of that. A couple have pled guilty. Larry Franklin and Shammai Lieberson actually pled guilty, probably mistakenly. They probably shouldn't have fought in court. So it isn't a big risk now. With the trend under Obama, and in your generation, or before, may well be before those of you graduate from law school who are here, we'll have a system where leaking does become really illegal if it isn't resisted very thoroughly now. And that'll mean we'll have even less information about all these dangers. So the reason I keep coming back to this, especially to a legal audience, is to say there is a legal challenge going right now. It will change the nature of our government and the relation to the people. It will mean that information does belong to the government, not to the public. It will mean that the public is not sovereign in any significant sense whatever, and it isn't much now, but it will be less. And it will mean that the chance of our getting into foolish, reckless, illegal, irresponsible wars like Vietnam and Iraq and the escalation in Afghanistan, and it could be in Pakistan, will be more easy to achieve by the government and more likely to occur than before. And the challenge could not be greater. So as lawyers, I hope you will stand up for a country, for the principles of a country that didn't make it illegal up till now to tell secrets of state that the public needed to hear.
Please join me in thanking our guest, Daniel Ellsberg.